I didn't come to Parasite Eve looking for something new. I came to it looking for more of the same. By the time I played it, my PlayStation brain had already been shaped. Not gently, aggressively. Resident Evil, then Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3 and Dino Crisis. That run rewired my brain. Fixed cameras, tank controls, inventory anxiety. The feeling that the screen was watching you back. That was survival horror as far as I understood it. So when I finally got my hands on Parasite Eve, illegally of course because it never came out in the UK, I wasn't curious, I was confident. I'd already played Parasite Eve 2 by then, and I loved it. It felt familiar, like another variation on a language I already spoke. So in my head, the first game wasn't really a question, it was just the origin story. When I put the first game in, on a chip PlayStation, through a dodgy SCART lead, on a CRT that was already losing the will to live, what I expected was simple. Another Resident Evil clone, another fixed camera angle nightmare, another game that spoke my language. And instead, I got something I didn't recognise. The screen was darker than it should have been, the characters looked off, movement felt slow like running through water, combat didn't explode into panic, it asked you to think, menus weren't somewhere you hid, they were where decisions piled up. That wasn't the horror I was chasing in the late 90s. It wasn't loud, it wasn't urgent, it wasn't trying to scare me the way I thought horror was supposed to. So I did what you did back then. I put the disc back into one of those cheap plastic sleeves, the kind you got from Poundland. No box, no ceremony, just quiet dismissal, and I moved on. It took years and better hardware, emulation and a completely different mindset to realise something uncomfortable. I hadn't rejected Parasite Eve because it failed. I rejected it because it refused to be what I wanted. Welcome to the PSX Index, I'm Parasite. There's something important to understand about how Parasite Eve arrived in my life and how that single fact shaped the entire relationship with this game before I ever really had a chance to understand it. It didn't arrive cleanly. This game was never released in the UK. Not delayed, not quietly shelved, just absent. So if you wanted to play it in the late 90s, you didn't walk into a shop and buy it, you worked around the problem. That usually meant a chipped PlayStation. Everyone seemed to know someone who had one, no one ever talked about it openly. Bootleg discs, foreign copies, grey market solutions to a problem that shouldn't have existed in the first place. By the time Parasite Eve reached me, it was already coming through layers of compromise. The PlayStation itself was chipped, purely for imports obviously, and because it was running US games, it needed a SCART lead instead of the old coaxial cable we'd mostly been using. The thing is, that SCART lead was terrible. I don't know if it was defective, I don't know if the CRT just wasn't up to it, but whatever signal was coming through, it made everything darker than it should have been. Not atmospheric, not cinematic, just dim. And Parasite Eve is already a dark game. Muted colours, nighttime streets, interiors lit more by mood than clarity. So now imagine trying to navigate that, not as an adult with setting menus and brightness sliders, but as a kid on a second-hand CRT, squinting into blacks that swallowed detail. Enemies blended into the background, environmental cues disappeared, reading the space became harder than it needed to be. Before I'd even engaged with the systems, the game felt hostile. Not because it was challenging, but because I couldn't see it properly. And that matters, because when you're young, you don't separate the game from the conditions you played it under. You don't think, this cable's bad. You think, this game feels wrong. So the early impressions stacked up fast. The visuals didn't pop like Parasite Eve 2. The character models felt less polished. The environments felt flat, heavy and unclear. And instead of wondering why, I assumed I already knew. By that point, I trusted my instincts. My horror instinct had been validated again and again by Resident Evil and Dino Crisis. So when Parasite Eve didn't immediately slot into that rhythm, when it asked for patience, attention, clarity, the compromise setup that turned friction into rejection, it wasn't just different, it felt inaccessible. And that's the unfair part, because this wasn't the game failing to communicate, it was the circumstances. Region locks, bad hardware, workarounds stacked up on top of expectations, all of it shaping an opinion before the game ever had a chance to speak for itself. By the time I put the disc away, I wasn't rejecting Parasite Eve, I was rejecting an experience that never really belonged to it in the first place. By the time Parasite Eve asked for my attention, it was already arriving late. Not just geographically, but psychologically. I didn't come to it fresh. I came to it after a very specific run of games that had trained me how to read danger. Those games taught me that survival horror lived in a space, in corridors, in camera angles, in the distance between you and the next door. They taught me that panic was physical. You ran, you aimed badly, you fumbled menus while Sutton closed the gap. So when Parasite Eve finally entered my life, it wasn't competing with nothing, it was competing with a language I'd already trusted. And the real problem was that I'd already played Parasite Eve 2. That game fit neatly into everything I understood. Fixed cameras, tank controls, dodging, shooting, enemies that behaved the way my instincts expected them to. Parasite Eve 2 felt like another survival horror game. Maybe a little more cinematic, a little more action leaning, but familiar enough that my brain immediately accepted it. So naturally, I assumed the first game would just be an earlier version of that. Less polished, less refined, but fundamentally the same. It wasn't. Parasite Eve didn't ask me to react, it asked me to plan. Movement wasn't about escape, it was about positioning. Combat wasn't about panic, it was about management. Enemies didn't overwhelm you immediately, they wore you down slowly. And the menus felt wrong to me at the time. In Resident Evil, menus were shelter. You paused the game, you breathed, you regrouped. In Parasite Eve, menus were where you committed to decisions that echoed forward. Stats, abilities, weapon tuning, things that didn't resolve immediately but followed you. As a kid who wasn't an RPG guy, that didn't feel deep, it felt heavy. I hadn't grown up on Final Fantasy or Chrono Trigger or Vagrant Story. Squaresoft wasn't part of my vocabulary yet. So when Parasite Eve blended horror with RPG systems, I didn't see ambition. I saw something getting in the way of the fear I was chasing. The irony is that nothing about Parasite Eve was actually clunky, it was just deliberate. Aya didn't panic in the way Jill or Claire did. She assessed, she waited, she committed, and at the time, that calmness felt wrong, because my idea of horror was urgency, so the mismatch hardened quickly. The compromise setup from before didn't help. The darker image, the unclear environments, but even without that, the truth is, I wasn't meeting Parasite Eve halfway. I was asking it to become something else, something it was never trying to be, and once that expectation set in, the rejection became easy. Not dramatic, not angry, just a quiet decision that it wasn't for me, at least, not yet. It wasn't until much later that Parasite Eve found me again. Not because I went looking for it, but because the barriers that kept it at arm's length had quietly disappeared. By the time Emulation became normal, everything changed. No region locks, no chipped consoles, no bootleg discs. Just the game, running cleanly at the brightness it was supposed to be seen at. DuckStation and EPSXE before that. Suddenly, Parasite Eve wasn't something you had to work around. It was just there, and by then, I was different too. I wasn't chasing the next survival horror fix anymore. I'd already drained Parasite Eve 2 dry. Every difficulty, every challenge, every self-imposed rule I could think of. In fact, that was the game that started this entire PSX Index project in the first place. Parasite Eve 2 on Nightmare mode, because that's how I enjoy it now. So when I came back to the first game, it wasn't from hunger, it was from curiosity. I wasn't asking it to be Resident Evil anymore. I wasn't asking it to be Parasite Eve 2. I was finally willing to meet it at its own terms. And once you do that, Parasite Eve changes completely. The movement that once felt slow now felt intentional. The combat that once felt clunky now felt measured. Menus stopped feeling like interruptions and started feeling like tension, because now I understood what the game was really doing. It wasn't trying to scare me with sudden danger, it was asking me to live with my decisions. Every stat upgrade mattered, every ability choice carried forward, every weapon tweak quietly shaped the hours ahead. That kind of pressure doesn't hit immediately, it accumulates, and as an adult, that landed differently. I had patience I didn't have as a kid, context I didn't have, a wider language for what games could be. I could appreciate restraint, deliberateness, systems that trusted you to pay attention, and once that clicked, something uncomfortable happened. I realised I hadn't grown into Parasite Eve. I'd finally stopped trying to dominate it. The game wasn't asked to be beaten aggressively, it was asked to be understood, and when I let go of the idea that horror had to chase me down corridors, a different kind of tension settled in, quieter, more intentional, more internal, the kind that follows you even when nothing is happening on screen. That's when Parasite Eve stopped feeling like rejection and started feeling like something I'd missed. Once you strip away what I wanted Parasite Eve to be, something clearer starts to emerge. This was never a survival horror game in the way Resident Evil was. It borrows pieces of the language, fixed cameras, limited movement, uneasy spaces, but that's not where the centre of gravity lives. Parasite Eve is a horror game built around systems, not reflexes, not panic, systems. Where Resident Evil externalises fear, monsters in corridors, danger chasing you, Parasite Eve internalises it. The threat isn't just what's on screen, it's what you've already chosen. Combat isn't about reacting quickly, it's about positioning, timing and commitment. You don't spray bullets and hope something falls over. You decide where Aya stands, you decide where to engage, you decide how much risk you're willing to carry forward, and then the game remembers. That's the key difference. Menus aren't safe spaces here, they're where the long-term damage happens. Stats don't just make numbers go up, they lock you into a version of Aya. Abilities aren't flavour, they define how the rest of the game unfolds. Weapon tuning isn't cosmetic, it quietly decides whether future encounters feel manageable or punishing. As a kid, that felt like friction. As an adult, it feels like confidence. Because Parasite Eve trusts you. It trusts you to understand that fear doesn't always arrive immediately. Sometimes it shows up hours later, when a bad decision comes back to collect. That's where the horror lives. And that's why the game never quite fit into the survival horror conversation at the time. It wasn't chasing the same audience. Squaresoft wasn't trying to clone Resident Evil. They were trying to do something more awkward and more ambitious. Take the pacing. There are long stretches where nothing attacks you. You move through real world spaces, streets, stations, museums, with a sense that something is wrong, but not yet hostile. The game lets tension sit. It doesn't jump at you constantly, it lets your brain fill in the gaps. That restraint felt alien in the late 90s, when horror was getting louder and more confident. But it's also what gives Parasite Eve its identity. It's horror filtered through RPG logic. Not can you survive this room, but can you live with what you've already done? And Aya is central to that. She doesn't frail, she doesn't panic, she stands still while the world unravels around her. That calmness isn't lack of emotion, it's composure, which makes the body horror, the scientific obsession, the slow biological collapse of the world around her hit harder. The game isn't screaming at you to be afraid. It's asking you to pay attention. That's why it felt wrong when I was young, and why it feels so deliberate now. Parasite Eve isn't survival horror with RPG elements. It's an RPG that uses horror as pressure, and once you understand that, everything else starts to fall in place. One of the strongest things about Parasite Eve is how strong its central character is. Considering how little she actually says, Aya Brea isn't chatty, she isn't chirpy, she doesn't explain herself, and yeah, she carries an enormous presence. Part of that is animation, the way she stands, the way she moves, the way she reacts without overreacting. Part of it is framing. The camera often treats her as something steady in the world that's slowly unravelling, but mostly it's restraint. Aya doesn't panic when everything around her starts to break down. She absorbs it, processes it, keeps moving. That calm gives her weight. She doesn't feel like a player avatar. She feels like someone who belongs in this world, and that world matters. Parasite Eve doesn't trap you into a mansion or a police station. It places you in New York, a real city abstracted through PS1 limitations, but instantly recognisable. Central Park at night, Soho streets, the National History Museum. These aren't gothic fantasy places. They're public, familiar places, turned quiet, emptied and wrong. There's something especially unsettling about that. You're not somewhere cursed, you're somewhere you recognise. The horror isn't introduced through architecture, it's introduced through absence. Empty streets, closed doors, a city holding its breath, and then there's the music. This is one of those soundtracks that engraves itself into your memory. I could go a year without playing Parasite Eve, without hearing a single track, and still hum entire pieces from it without thinking. That's not nostalgia, that's imprinting. The music doesn't try to overwhelm you. It doesn't constantly remind you that something is wrong. It drifts, it pulses, it lingers just enough to make silence uncomfortable. On PS1 hardware, composers had to be economical. They couldn't rely on lush fidelity or endless layers, so themes mattered, and Parasite Eve's themes do a huge amount of emotional work. They give places identity, they give scenes memory. Long after you forget exact mechanics or enemy layouts, those tracks stay. They're the connective tissue between the system's heavy gameplay and the emotional experience. Aya, the city, the music, together they give Parasite Eve a sense of place that survives its era. That's why coming back to it later in life feels so different. You're not just revisiting a game, you're visiting a mood, one that was easy to miss when you were chasing fear, but impossible to ignore once you'd learned to sit with it. There's a strange kind of regret that comes with Parasite Eve. Not the loud kind, not the dramatic self-flagellating version, just the quiet awareness that for a long time I didn't meet it fairly. Some of that was circumstance, region locks, bad hardware, the realities of being a kid in the UK in the late 90s. But some of that was mindset. I wanted horror to behave in a certain way. I wanted it to chase me. I wanted it to panic me. And Parasite Eve refused, so I missed something. Not forever, but long enough that it still stings a bit. What makes that harder is knowing how rare this game actually is. Parasite Eve didn't just combine RPG systems with horror aesthetics, it fused them in a way that felt intentional. Not a gimmick, not a genre experiment, a statement. And Square never really returned to that statement. The series didn't fade away gracefully. It stumbled. The third birthday exists, and I won't pretend it doesn't, but it isn't the continuation the game deserved. Aya becomes louder, the tone becomes messier, the restraint disappears. It feels like the wrong answer to the right questions. And since then, silence, licensing issues, rights complications, a story tangled up in ownership rather than memory, which makes Parasite Eve feel unfinished in a way few PS1 games do. Not because the original lacked closure, but because the idea behind it was never allowed to grow. That's why it's frustrating, because even now, this game feels modern in its restraint. Menus as consequence, systems as pressure, horror that doesn't shout. You see its influence echoed elsewhere, in games that understand that fear doesn't need to be loud to be effective, and when something like Parasite Mutant appears, clearly inspired, clearly respectful, and feels like recognition Square itself never quite gave. A reminder that people remember this, that Aya Brea still matters to people more than the company that created it seems to realise. At 36, I could admit something I couldn't when I was younger. Even though Parasite Eve 2 is a game I grew up with, the one I knew inside out, the first Parasite Eve is the masterpiece. Not because it's perfect, but because it knew exactly what it wanted to be. It didn't chase trends, it didn't try to outdo its peers. It trusted the player to slow down, and that trust is rare. Parasite Eve is index entry 43. That brings us to 43 games down, 1,235 to go. Next time, we're going back to Raccoon City, but not to where it began, to where it exploded. Resident Evil 2. This has been Parasite. The index continues. Head to the station, I'll meet you there.